Okay.
Yeah.
Science communication and outreach. I do it.
Yeah. I do it.
You do it. It's good. I think it's good. Do it.
Yeah.
It helps a lot with your communication skills, with communicating with not just the public but with science. Like the communication skills I've learnt through outreach have helped me be a good communicator in conference talks and things.
I think it's good as well as, for me, sometimes, you can get really embedded in what you're doing and these tiny details, and, I spend all of my day programming, and sometimes I find myself almost forgetting and falling out of love with, for me, astronomy is what I do. So when I go and I spend an evening talking to 8 and 9-year-olds who are just so excited by everything, it really brings me up. It gives me a bit of a lift, and it says, I remember, this is why I chose to do this. This is what I love doing, and it gives me a bit of a boost.
And I have friends who want to get into science communication and outreach, and their supervisors don't want them to. In that case, I think you can negotiate with your supervisor, and it's good to know what outreach helps you with. So you can negotiate with your supervisor and tell them that, look, it's been shown that outreach and science communication help you communicate to other scientists at conferences and things. And occasionally you can just win a little bit of money. One of my supervisors did encourage me to get into science communication and outreach, but then when I actually had to disappear from the lab for an afternoon, he wasn't too happy about it. When I came back with a $1,000 check because I'd come second at this science communication competition, he was back on board again.
Yeah.
It's really good to do. It's good for you. It's good for the community. Do science communication and try and negotiate with your supervisor to have them let you do communication, but don't overdo it.
Yeah, sometimes it can, I think for some people that I know, it has sort of started to interfere with their work. Back to kind of the supervisor thing, and this is really when it starts to interfere with work, is if you don't tell your supervisor what you're doing before you do it. It's often, you do need to negotiate and say, I'm doing this thing, this is why I'm doing it, and I'm maybe prioritizing it for these days over this other piece of work. So do keep the communication channels open with your supervisor about it. And I think when it really starts to be that you are spending a lot of your working hours on outreach as opposed to working on your project and meeting milestones, making progress, it can begin to interfere, and that can be a bit problematic. Although sometimes people find that, they're doing research and they do this SciComm on the side, and then they realize, actually, my passion is actually communicating the science, not so much doing it. And I do know people who've gone sideways and gone from doing research to actually doing the science communication full time. And if you are finding a lot more pleasure in the communication of the science than doing your own science, maybe that's something you might have to consider. It's not out of the question.
But if you want your PhD in your original project, there's a limit to the science communication you do. And it's the same for teaching.
Yes.
Teaching is a really good thing to do. Helps with your communication skills, helps with your future career. If you want a career in academia, teaching is important, and you'll build those teaching skills by teaching undergraduates and postgraduates. Teaching skills are transferable to other things.
Yes.
And again, don't do too much of it. It's easy to wind up doing too much teaching. I did a bit too much teaching, but sort of through press ganging. I did actually say no. I can't demonstrate that lab. I don't have enough time. Oh, well, we've really got no one else who can do it. Can you please do it? Okay. It worked out well in the end. But I did do a bit too much towards the end.
I think the thing with teaching that you often forget, and as a student, often what you'll end up doing is lab demonstrating and marking, or tutorial demonstrating and marking. The operative word in all of that is the marking. That, for me, when I'm teaching, is what takes up my time. It takes up a lot more time than you expect it to. For example, if I'm allocated 3 paid hours to mark, I'll usually end up working 5.
Yeah.
The marking can take up a huge amount of time. The other thing is, if you're delivering lectures or tutorials, don't underestimate the amount of prep time that goes in. Okay, once you've done it, because you've taught the same course for a while, so you've got a lot of prepared material.
I've taught the same course for 4 years, so there was a bigger time investment in the first year I taught it,
Yeah.
and then there's still a time investment as I've sort of modified and upgraded my material.
Yeah.
As I've learnt and got better at doing it, I've changed my material up, and so it's taken less time. But the first year I did it, I spent a decent chunk of a weekend putting
Yeah.
together a lot of the material before my courses.
Yeah, it can really depend as well what you're teaching, and you'll find that as you go through, if you begin teaching sort of third, fourth master's level courses, which is what I've been doing, you will have to spend a lot more time working on the content because, yes, I studied general relativity in my fourth year. I know the content. Do I know it well enough to teach 3 years after I sat the course? No, I have to actually go through the notes. I have to go over everything. I have to, make sure I'm getting all of, my subscripts and superscripts in the right place. And it can actually be a bit of a time investment to plan the lecture. And you are going to be lecturing, if you're lecturing, for around an hour, which is a long time. And I think usually they schedule about 2 hours prep time into what you get paid for at universities. You may find it takes longer than that.
We have a scale depending on level and whether it's
Okay,
prepared or basic and the expertise that's expected to go into it.
Yeah.
I think some of them do up to like 5 hours per lecture. Like a prepared lecture, they expect you as an expert to have put 5 hours into preparing this lecture.
Yeah.
So that's what the university's expecting. And so it could
Yeah.
have taken more. But teaching's really good to do, and for me it's a nice break from the lab. I get out of the lab, go and teach for an hour, and then I'm hoarse and I'm happy to get back to the lab and away from teaching.
Yeah, it can break things up. Once again, it's probably something you really need as a PhD student or a master's student or even an honours student to negotiate with your supervisor. Because it will take time away from your research. And at the end of the day, you do at some point need to finish your PhD. I guess some of this is a bit more Australia specific as well, because in the US, you will probably be expected to teach. In Australia, it's really strictly optional. You have a choice as to whether you do it or not. But then again...
It depends on your group. I've got some friends who they were basically told, you are doing this marking, you are doing these tutorials, go.
It technically is supposed to be optional.
Yeah, it's technically voluntary.
But in the US, you have a lot longer to finish your PhD. In Australia, we're quite pushed for, and Europe as well, I think, has this issue, you're pushed for time. The other thing is, if you do want to go on in academia, is it can be a good opportunity while you're doing a PhD to look into co-supervising a student, supervising an undergraduate project, co-supervising, for example, even a master's student. As you get more senior, you may find that you can actually come on board and help your supervisor with their master's students' work.
And related, if you're teaching undergraduates through lecturing and tutoring, that's a way to attract prospective postgraduates to your group.
Yes.
And so teaching is really valuable to your research group in that regard.
Yeah.
In your PhD, you're going to have to deal with unforeseen problems. Some of these problems are physical, some of these problems are people. And they're many and varied. They can range from your supervisor leaving the university or dying, harassment, depending on how you want to pronounce it, experiments not working, resources not being there when you need them to be unable to make certain field trips or get certain permissions. There's a huge range. Psychological stuff, so dealing with things like imposter syndrome or other trauma, family members dying. There's a huge range of problems. We can't cover them all. The point is we can cover what support structures are there for you. Now, not all universities have these same support structures, but at my university it's pretty good. There's the student guild to go to, there's the university's own psychologists and support structures. The Postgraduate Student Association here has support structures. There are people and institutions you can go and talk to, whether it's you need cash for a trip or just to get you through rent for the month, or people to talk to about an emotionally sensitive issue. We have wards in this department for diversity and equity, so if you are feeling harassed, if you feel there's a problem, you have a range of those people you can go and talk to, different genders, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, and you will be able to find someone who's understanding. What sort of structures are in place at your place?
With the Australian National University, of course, there's all of the central services, student support. There's, of course, the undergraduate and postgraduate students associations, which do a lot of work, especially in terms of helping with financial support for people. There are counselling services available through the university.
That's the word I was looking for, counselling.
Counselling.
Yeah.
You can also, access these services actually out in the community as well. So you'll actually often be able to find bulk billed or discounted psychologists that you can often talk to. If you're in a town where there is a university and you do go to these services, you'll actually find that they very often see people coming from the university, because it is, unfortunately, it can and is at times a very stressful thing to do. The other thing is that you also have your network around you. You have your peers, you have your fellow postgraduate students, your fellow students, and as well, if you've got a good relationship with your supervisor, they can often help you access the services that you need. In terms of things like equity, diversity, and harassment, I think most universities in Australia now tend to have committees set up to try and advocate for diversity and equity issues. If your university or your school doesn't have one, it may actually be worth approaching the people who are in the higher ups to say, this is something that I think we need. You can tell them about initiatives like the Pleiades Award, which comes through the ASA, and that's to recognise the efforts that universities go to promote diversity. There's also something called SAGE, which is also equity and diversity. It's awards for departments and universities, and it's modelled on this thing called Athena Swan, which is a UK initiative. So these things definitely exist, and the services are there. It can sometimes be a bit opaque as to how to access them, but often the students' associations and other students in your institution will be able to help you find out exactly how to access those services.
And that's at the extreme level. First place to go to is your friend's network.
Yeah.
And you're not the only person who needs support. Your supervisor is also working very hard. They can need support as well. I know my supervisors work very, very hard and don't have a lot of time, and to an extent they're relying on you as their PhD student to be able to take a certain part of the load of the research and the teaching often, and it's good for you to help them by doing what you can do. If you need to meet with them, scheduling in advance rather than just going to their office and grabbing them when they're unwary. And if you need to go to them with a problem, try and prepare as best you can. Have if it's a research problem, have the papers and resources ready to discuss, rather than just going and saying, there's this big problem, I need you to solve it for me. Help them to help you. Keep them well rested, fed and watered, clean their lid box occasionally.
So the other...
You've got to keep them stimulated, just the right amount, take them
toys,
for walks.
I think the other...
Coffee.
Buy them coffee every so often, actually. Yeah, that works really... I found that works really well.
Or
surprise them with a coffee.
Or beer if they drink.
Okay,
if they drink.
Red
After
wine.
work. After
Yes.
work. Or during work, it depends on your supervisor.
The other thing is that no matter how well you get along with your supervisor, there will be times where you have a disagreement and there may be a little bit of conflict. I get along really, really well with my supervisors and my main supervisor, but that doesn't mean to say that we've not had occasions where we haven't communicated each other's needs to one another as well as we could. It's like any relationship, there's always going to be conflict, and it's about how you deal with the conflict that really defines your relationship. And as you go on through your PhD, you're going to find that you become more independent. You maybe need less of somebody looking over your shoulder and telling you what to do. And you need to start communicating to your supervisor your needs. I actually have another blog post on this topic on my blog.
I'll put a link in the description.
So it's a little bit about this. is actually communicating with your supervisor and dealing with these conflicts. And you just need to tell them what your needs are. If you want to explore an idea that you think is interesting, you can do that. You just need to go to your supervisor and say, hey, I've found this really interesting thing. What do you think? I'd like to explore this on my own. If you want to be a little more independent, you can communicate that. If the way your supervisor is communicating with you feels, for example, like they're being very critical, often that it's not actually criticism, but it may just be the way that they're actually communicating. And also, having more people on your supervisory panel is excellent in this regard, because you can have other people there who provide somewhat of a dispassionate view of things. They can mediate for you in these situations. That's certainly happened with me. You can sometimes get stuck in a rut where the paper is being rehashed again and again and again with you and your supervisor, and at some point you do just need to leave it. And if you're dealing with two perfectionists, which can often be the situation, it certainly is for me, you need somebody to come in and say, leave it, publish the damn thing already. So having more people to provide somewhat of a dispassionate view and mediate can be really useful.
But start communicating early. Don't let it build up to a problem. Communicate early. My supervisor's good at that. If he thinks I'm doing too much teaching or too much outreach, he'll tell me early rather than letting it build up to a problem. So, I needed that done last week, so I'm angry now. He doesn't do that. He's good.
Yeah, I think
he communicates early.
On that communicating early thing as well is be aware loosely of your supervisor's career stage. Be aware of whether their funding may run out before your PhD ends. This actually caused an enormous amount of stress for me in my first year. I thought I was going to lose all of my supervisors. And because there was a little bit of a breakdown in communication, because it was a hard thing to talk about, we both ended up in quite a bad place individually. And it really did actually affect our research. So if you know that there's going to have to be some kind of departure and changing of supervision, or there's some kind of pressure around funding, I would advise trying to open up the communication channels around that. It can just lessen the stress for everybody involved.
So all 5 of yours were going to go?
Well, I didn't have the 2 at the time, so all 3 of mine were actually going to go.
Oh, okay.
So that was why the other 2 came in.
I'm in a pretty good situation where, of my 2, they're in very different situations. So if something like that happened, only one would be leaving or dying.
Dark.
But important,
Yes.
because it does happen.
Oh, it does.
And
it's
it wouldn't have
before.
been. It would have been a problem. Might have even caused a delay, but the other supervisor would have been able to take up the slack.
So actually, on that note, actually, it can be worth finding supervisors who do as I say, not as I do, are more senior, that have permanent positions. That way you're less likely to end up in a situation of having a supervisor not get a contract extension or a permanent job at your institution and no longer having your supervisor. So it is something to bear in mind.
Yep. Or do what one of my PhD friends is doing, move with them to the other side of the planet.
Not
an option for everybody. Not an option I would like.
No.
At some point, you're going to fail, and you're going to have to deal with rejection of conference talks, rejection of papers, potentially even rejection of your thesis. You haven't submitted your thesis yet, so you haven't had the big one. I was good. I got minor revisions, passed with minor revisions. So that was a weight off my mind, and I could breathe again. But I've had papers rejected. Have you had papers rejected?
I was blessed, actually. I was one of the very, very rare cases where I had minor revisions. And I say it's rare because I really quote the monthly notice of the Royal Astronomical Society letters webpage here. So when you go and submit your paper, it tells you the different things that can happen to your paper. You can get accepted without revision. That doesn't happen. You can get minor corrections where you'll just have a few little things to tweak. You've probably forgotten some capital letters. But overall, there's no, you don't need to remake any plots. You don't need to, completely change your method. The most common thing which happens is major revisions. That is the number one most common thing which happens, and it can feel like a rejection, because often the reviewer might seem, at first reading, very critical. This method is not correct, this method is inadequate, this doesn't look right, please go and redo all of these calculations. And I really speak for astronomy here in that I think it's very different in other sciences where you have big experiments which take months to run. Within theoretical astrophysics, we're really just essentially we only have one experiment we can run. We don't have repeatability issues. And actually, no, that's not true. I have had a paper rejected. I just wasn't the first author.
Oh.
I have had a paper rejected. It was rejected from 2 journals.
Yeah. Oh.
And then it went to a 3rd journal where we had major revisions, and then it got accepted.
So my big soul-consuming paper that ate my soul over the course of about 3, 4, 5 months, that got rejected the first time, and it didn't even get to the reviewers. The editor rejected it basically because he thought it was boring.
That was what happened to... So this paper that eventually got actually published in Nature Astronomy was rejected from both Nature and Science on the basis that it wasn't interesting or newsworthy enough for them. They didn't care.
Okay. So it got rejected before review, but then the next journal I submitted it to loved it. The reviewer loved it, and it was passed with minor revisions, or accepted with minor revisions. I have had a paper that's been rejected from 2 journals in a row. It happens. I think I'm sort of good at dealing with it. I just move on. I've had advice from other people that if it's a major rejection, like a big important paper or, say, your thesis or a grant application, mourn for 24 hours and then move on. You've got the day of mourning, move on.
Yeah.
If it's that big that you do actually need to mourn about it, rather than just think, okay, next journal.
I think the thing as well is you're going to get the reviewer comments back, and this is going to be probably quite emotionally charged. I think a lot of people think, I'm not going to get affected by this, I'm going to be fine. No, accept that especially the first time, is going to be in a very, very emotionally charged occasion, and you are going to feel a lot of things. You're probably going to go through the 5 stages of grief in about 5 minutes that it takes you to read the comments. What to do is to read the comments, feel the feelings, cry, do whatever you need to do, and then walk away from it. Walk away from it, and when you feel okay, come back and reread them. If you still feel like this is some big emotionally charged thing, you need to walk away again. Do not start responding to reviewer comments until you can look at them completely dispassionately. Because otherwise, you're going to write something snarky, you're going to piss off the reviewer.
Yeah.
And the best thing to do is, get to the point where you can say, no, I'm looking at this objectively, and I can understand where they're coming from, and what they're actually trying to do is they're trying to make your paper better. They're trying to make it...
Most of the time.
Improve it, well...
Sometimes you can get a reviewer who is a jerk.
Yeah.
But most of the time they are making a critical assessment of your research and trying to make it better.
If you do get a jerk reviewer, though, there are actually quite a few things you can do. If it is beginning to look like the reviewer maybe it's some kind of personal attack, it is maybe quite unpleasant, you can actually go to the editor and request a new reviewer. You certainly can for a lot of the astronomy and physics journals that I've had experience with. In fact, when you submit the paper, you also have the option to exclude people.
Yeah.
So if there's somebody in the past who, this is maybe as you go further along in your career, that you have had a personal disagreement with, where things have gotten nasty, you can actually exclude them from reviewing your paper. And I know people who do exclude people from reviewing their papers because they know the reviewer won't be objective. And that, at the end of the day, is what a review is. It's an objective, independent assessment of whether or not the research is of good quality. And all the comments are doing is they're saying, this is how to improve the quality of this paper. It's not personal, it's not an attack on you, and if it is, there are things you can do about it, and it's wrong. So it's not your fault if that does happen, and it can be sorted.
For me, I like to focus on what the reviews have taught me, because if it's been rejected for some reason, if it's a good review, they've explained why, and so you can learn from that. Turn it into a learning experience.
Yeah.
More than for 24 hours, come back, look at it objectively, learn from it, move on.
And at the end of the day, you will likely, if you do go on to have an academic career, you need to really start to harden yourself to rejection. I say this as someone who has been quite affected by this in the past, but you will be rejected. You'll be rejected from jobs, your papers will get rejected, you won't get into conferences. You know, this is something which is going to actually become part of your life. One thing which is really interesting is a few senior academics have started posting online these CVs of rejection. So rather than, you think of someone famous and all of these successes they've had, some of these people are actually starting to post CVs showing all of the things they were rejected from in order to get to where they are now. And it can be a really good thing, is if you're feeling bad about it, is to go and have a look at some of these things and say, actually, hey, rejection's totally normal, it happens to everyone, and this is just my time, and at some other point I'm going to have a success. It's about getting into perspective.
Okay, you've started your PhD, you've made it through your PhD, you've maybe published a few papers dealing with the rejection, and you're writing your thesis. We've sort of discussed already writing theses. I went back and looked at old theses in my field to find out what to do, and so I could model my thesis based on theses from other universities and from my own university, and in the end something came together that I was happy with. Do you have any writing tips?
I would say start is my one tip. I know, and this goes for anybody writing a dissertation or thesis, I know so many people who started writing a couple of months before it was due. I would say it's never too early to start putting stuff into a template, even just bullet pointed lists that you can go back to every couple of months and update. The main advice that I have is start, and if you start, it becomes less of a gargantuan task that you have to overcome. It's more of a thing you can tackle in little bite-sized chunks.
My supervisor actually had me write a thesis skeleton as part of my confirmation of candidature, which is something we have to do during our first year to become a fully fledged PhD candidate by the end of our first year. I had to write a thesis skeleton as part of that. It was largely dot points. I wound up with about 50 pages of thesis skeleton just in dot points from the end of my first year of PhD, just putting in all my experiments, all the reading and literature review I'd already done at the time, just in dot point form. And to my surprise, my supervisor still had expected me to do more than that, but oh well. But of those 50 pages, most of it got rejected. I wound up with 9 pages of useful stuff that wound up in my final thesis, but that was 9 pages of stuff I copied and pasted across into my final thesis. So it's never too early to start. The first draft is going to be rubbish. Get the rubbish written down and delete what you don't need later on. Start early. Well, I think we've said all we're going to say for now. There's a lot more we could have covered. There are so many problems, so many issues. We'll put a few links to a few resources down in the comments, but I think that's all for now. So, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I can't take sitting here seriously while you're doing that.